So the other day, I was browsing YouTube when I came across this very positive review featuring a Sony stereo receiver. Now, this video was uploaded by another YouTuber named Andrew Robinson. And if you haven't seen his assessment, just go ahead and click on the description box and follow that link to check it out once you're done watching this review. Anyways, as I was watching his assessment, it dawned on me about how the audiophile press tends to ignore products in this category, which I think is a shame for many reasons. I mean, number one, most real-world people who are looking for a stereo solution are going to be buying products like this and not expensive hi-fi exotica. And then number two, I think it's important to reconnect with your roots because as audiophiles, this is largely where we come from. And then number three, come on, who doesn't like a good value for the money? So, after checking out his assessment and reading a couple other reviews, I just straight up went out and bought one for myself. Now, I did this for two reasons. Number one, I'm curious. I just want to experience what all the fuss is all about. But then, most importantly, number two, I wanted to see if this unit truly was special and is something that I can begin recommending to people who are looking for a solution in this range. So, having said all of that, let's go ahead and check it out. So here it is, the mighty Sony STR-DH190 stereo receiver. So why don't we get some boring specifications out of the way first? This receiver weighs 14 pounds. It's rated at outputting 100 watts per channel into 8 ohms, which should be more than enough power for most of you. And it carries a price tag of roughly $149 US. And sometimes it's even known to go on sale for as low as $99. And what I like so much about it is not only is this receiver accessible, meaning that most of you watching this video right now could likely bring one in, but it's also pretty affordable as far as audio products are concerned. Now, let's take a closer look at what you get by taking a closer look at the front. Now, as you can tell, it has this sleek design, which should go well in most rooms. The front of the unit is made mostly out of plastic materials, but the rest of it uses a thin sheet metal material, which is pretty standard fare for a receiver in this price class. So up top, we have the Sony badge. Then we have a power button, a headphone jack, a mini jack input, which is nice. And then we have this menu system. You see a button named speakers, and this receiver can power up to 4 speakers at a time, and this button allows you to switch between them. The next 3 buttons are going to be for tuner function. We have our display right there in the middle. And then as we move to the right side, you will see these 2 large knobs. One is our input selector knob and the other is our volume knob. And yes, while they're plastic, they actually offer pretty good resistance. Now on top in the menu, we have a display button, a dimmer button in case you don't want this light beaming at you at night. We then have a Bluetooth button, so this is how you pair the receiver to your Bluetooth device, and it's important to note that it can only pair up to 1 Bluetooth device at a time. And then we have the pure direct button, and this is how you achieve the best sound quality out of this unit, because once you activate it, it will disable everything in the circuit path that's not related to sound quality. As you can tell, the light just went off on the receiver because, again, it's just trying to give you the shortest, most pure signal path, as the name implies. And then lastly, we have the remote control. Now, I usually don't go over remote controls in my videos, but I really like the layout of this remote. Every function that you reasonably will use is within easy reach, and plus it's very easy to read. But then again, I would expect something like this from the makers of the PlayStation. Anyway, that's it for the front of the unit, so now let's take a look at the back. Okay, so here's the back of the 190, so now it's time to go over its features starting from left to right. On the very top left-hand corner, we have a spot for our FM antenna. Now it's important to note that this receiver will take in an FM signal, but not an AM signal. Next to that, to the right, we have what looks to be a USB input, but is actually a service port. Now, on the bottom row, on the very left-hand side, we have a moving magnet phonostage, which honestly is pretty nice to see for something at this price point. But note that I said moving magnet and not moving coil. To the right of that, we have a whole bunch of different RCA inputs. We have 3 analog RCA inputs to be precise. And then next to that, we have something that's a little confusing due to how it's labeled, but it's actually a record in and out. And then in the center, Whew, we have our clip style speaker connectors. Now, I'm not a big fan of this. I don't know of anybody who is, but I get it. Sony built this unit to a price point. I just hope that in the future they go with more of your conventional 5-way binding post for the next model. But I need to stop right here and mention something very important, especially to those of you who are new to the world of stereo. You see, you need to be selective about the speakers that you pair up to this receiver. And it has nothing to do with watt ratings. Forget about that. That's not even an important specification. But what is important is the speaker's impedance rating, which when you look on the speaker spec sheet is rated in ohms, because this receiver is designed to pair up well to speakers that are rated at 6 ohms or higher, which is good news because most of the speakers that are sold along with units like this are 6 ohms or higher. However, if you have a speaker that's rated beneath that, let's just say 4 ohms, then it is not going to make for a good match, and odds are the power supply is not going to be able to hold up over the long haul. So if you're concerned about long-term reliability, just make sure your speakers are rated at 6 ohms or higher. Moving on to the very right, we have an attached power cord, which quite frankly is par for the course in this price range. I have no problems with it, which means it's now finally time to go over how this unit performs and quite frankly to find out if it's any good. So let's get right to it. Okay, so when I first listened to this receiver, two things immediately caught my attention and quite frankly took me by surprise. The first being its voicing, which I would describe as being balanced and relatively neutral, meaning that the treble, the mid-range, and the bass are integrated together very well, with nothing about its presentation being voiced to purposely jump out to catch your attention. Now, this is unusual for a product in this category because, as some of you know, what a lot of manufacturers do is that they will purposely voice their components to sound impressive in the store. That way you make an impulse buying decision. And usually how they do this is they bump the treble to make the sound more detailed, or they'll bump up the bass to sound impressive in that regard. But Sony went in the other direction. And the benefit to this is you now have a product that will sound good with a lot of different loudspeakers. It really doesn't matter what you own, whether it's Klipsch or JBL, Polk Audio, Sony's own Core series, Triangle, and the list goes on and on. Meaning that you can now worry about the speakers that you like the most versus worrying about how they're going to pair up to your receiver. And to me, that's good news. And then next, it was the spatial separation. Let me explain what I mean. When you're listening to a complex recording, let's just say there's multiple vocalists, you have a lot of different people playing instruments, a lot of affordable products, while they will play the sound, they won't give everything its own individual, distinct sense of space. Instead, it just kind of mushes everything together. This receiver, however, does not do that. In fact, it does an excellent job of giving each performer their own individual sense of space within the soundstage in a way that is freakishly good for the money. In fact, it's even better than some high-end pieces that I've heard in this regard, and I totally didn't expect that. So, those are the two highlights, so now let's move on to the individual performance character traits, starting with the treble. The treble is pretty darn neutral and even keeled, especially for something in this range. It is not bumped up, nor is it rolled off and meant to sound smooth with every recording or every speaker. Instead, it's a little bit more of an input-output situation. Now, if you are coming from, let's say, higher-end gear, this is where you're going to hear the budgetness of the Sony. It's not going to be as smooth and refined sounding as higher-end components, but for its price, and especially if this is your first rodeo, you're likely going to be just fine with it. And if you want to add more coloration to the sound, that's what tone controls are for. And now let's talk about the mid-range. So the mid-range, I think, is actually one of the other highlights to the performance of this unit, because while it's even keeled, it does have this slightly warm character to it. In fact, there's this good sense of scale and body to the sound. And in a way, it almost reminds me of the sound of a British amplifier, like let's just say Rega. It almost has this pace, rhythm, and timing that makes for a fun listen. And I know that's a very subjective thing to say, but that's just been my experience with it. And now let's talk about the bass. So your interpretation of the bass will depend on where you're coming from. So if you're replacing a vintage receiver that had a lot of bass, stepping up to the Sony, it may sound like it doesn't have enough low-end output, but really what you're experiencing is something that's pretty neutral. It's not bumped up, it's not going to be underdone, it's just more matter of fact. Now to me, I like the quality over quantity approach, but again, it just depends on where you're coming from. Now, moving on, let's talk about dynamic output, which is okay. It's just okay, right? It's not going to be absolutely stunning. It's just going to be okay. And then when it comes to power delivery, I think it is very good. A lot of manufacturers tend to fib about the power output ratings, but as I mentioned earlier, I think they're mostly on the nose with this one, and it should be able to drive most loudspeakers to most volumes that most people are going to listen at. So overall, when you add all of this together, you get a unit that sounds very fun. It lends itself well to a lot of different speakers, and thus it makes for a pretty easy recommendation, quite honestly. But it's not going to be perfect in terms of its performance, so let's go over some of those imperfections now. Okay, so let's be real. There's not a whole lot to complain about with this Sony receiver, because when you look at the accessibility, the performance that you get for the money, and the features, it's really good. But still, it's not alone in this segment. In fact, there's quite a few options out there, with the biggest competition in my eyes being those compact Class D amplifiers that you can buy off Amazon for the same price, and in some cases for a lot less money. And there is something to be said about those little Class D amplifiers, because they do offer a number of different advantages. Number one, most of them can drive a 4 ohm load all day long. They're very power efficient, so they don't soak up much power from the wall. And then they're very small. You can put them just about anywhere you want in the room. And then even beyond that, we have distinct sonic advantages. Usually they will sound cleaner, the bass will be more controlled, yet at the same time stronger, and oftentimes they will offer up a little bit more detail. But there's a compromise. Usually those Class D amplifiers won't have the same sense of body and scale that a receiver like the Sony will, and then oftentimes they have treble that's a little bit peaky with thin upper mid-range, meaning that they may not sound good with a wide variety of speakers. So you have to be a lot more careful when it comes to choosing the kind of speakers that will complement the sound of those little Class D amplifiers. But still, there are going to be people out there who will prefer them over the Sony. And to those of you who like that colorful presentation, let's just say boosted treble and boosted bass, well, that's what tone controls are for. And when it comes to a neutral product like the Sony, just use the speakers to give you that sound versus worrying about the electronics. At least that's my advice. Speaking of advice, let's go over the kind of speakers that really and truly work well with this unit. Okay, so this section is going to be short and sweet because, as I've repeated throughout this video, the Sony has the kind of balanced sound that lends itself well to a wide variety of speakers. In fact, throughout the reviewing process, I connected it to a number of different solutions. The Q-Acoustics 3020i, the Triangle Bro 3, the ELAC DBR62, the Sound Artist LS3 5As, and a set of Polk Audio towers, with my preference going to whichever speakers I just so happen to prefer in a specific application. So, next, let's talk about power output. As I mentioned before, it should have enough power to satisfy most people's needs. The critical thing here is that you really do need to pay attention to the manufacturer's recommendation. This receiver is meant for speakers that are rated at 6 ohms or higher, so that's what you want to stick with. Don't worry about the voicing of the product, just make sure that the impedance specification is in line with the manufacturer's recommendation. The reason being is the transformer on this unit is not meant to handle 4 ohm loads for a long period of time. That will compromise the reliability of this unit. And then lastly, just for fun, I want to mention an unusual synergy that just sounds really good with this unit, which is my Harbeth P3ESRs. Guys, that combination is far better than it should be. Now, I don't expect anybody to ever try this because those speakers are well over $2,000. But if somebody were to blindfold me and to tell me that I was listening to a $1,000 Rega amp, I would likely believe them, especially in the desktop environment. Just really cool stuff, and it's a fun thing to come across. Anyways, guys, that is going to be my take on this speaker, so why don't we go ahead and wrap this up. You know, guys, despite all of the technical issues that I ran into while filming this review, I've nonetheless had a good time talking about this receiver because, well, number one, it's far exceeded my expectations in terms of price to performance. And then number two, look, it's refreshing to come across something that's this competent in a price point that usually goes ignored by the audiophile press. So it looks like I'm joining Andrew and a couple other reviewers in saying that, yeah, this Sony is the real deal and it truly does offer great performance for the money. Now, to be clear, is it going to be for everybody? Well, of course not. Nothing is. Nor do I want to present it like it's some kind of giant killer, because I don't think it is. If you spend a little bit more money, then yes, you'll stand a chance of achieving better performance. But that's not really my focus on this receiver. I like it for three primary reasons. Number one, its accessibility. Number two, I think the price is right. And then number three, and most importantly, I think it comes with well-rounded performance, the kind of sound that should make a lot of people happy. Which is why from this point onwards, it's now going to become my go-to recommendation for people who are looking for a solution in this particular price range. Anyways, guys, that's going to be my take on this Sony. Pretty cool stuff. As always, thanks for watching, and until next time, peace. Okay, so now it's time to go over information that didn't fit into the main body of my review. So let's get this started with the topic of DACs. As many of you will notice, this Sony receiver doesn't come with a built-in D to A converter, leading some of you to probably want to know, okay, well, what kind of DAC should I buy to go with this Sony? And this is where my utility may become very limited to you, because the only good affordable DAC that I'm familiar with is the Topping E30, which retails for $130, which just so happens to be pretty much the same price as the receiver itself. And I'm guessing this may be a no-go for some of you who are watching this video. Now, if you're in that position, my advice to you would be to just use the device that you currently own that you connect to this receiver. Whether it's a phone, a tablet, a laptop, a desktop, doesn't matter. All those units already have DACs built in, and just save your money until you can afford something like that Topping E30, because it really does sound good, and that's the kind of DAC I would endorse for something like this Sony stereo receiver. It's a very clean sound, very balanced, and they just go together very well. Now it's time to talk about comparison. So once again, I'm going to disappoint you a little bit because I don't have its direct competitors in-house, like the Sherwood receiver or the Yamaha stereo receiver. But what I do have in-house are a couple of really good integrated amplifiers that, yes, they're more money, but this also opens up the conversation of what you get when you spend a little bit more money. So we're going to be talking about the Vista Audio Spark 2 and the Iota VX SA3. First, let's talk about how the Sony receiver stacks up to the Vista Audio Spark 2. So overall, the Sony will actually have a couple of advantages. Number one, it is significantly more powerful. So if you listen at louder volumes, the Sony wins by default. And then it has a much bigger sense of scale and body, particularly within the mid-range. So overall, it gives you a fuller sound and it can go louder, or I should say, it can drive speakers to louder volumes. However, once you look beyond that, the Vista Audio Spark 2 is pretty much better in every other way. It's even more balanced between the treble, the mid-range, and the bass. There's much more resolution. It's a lot more transparent. It has better and more accurate tone. The bass is quicker. The mid-range takes on more of an accurate presentation. The treble is smoother and more refined by direct comparison. It's just a better sounding unit in pretty much every way. But you have to live with this compromise, since it's not a very powerful unit, limiting its function in the real world. And now let's talk about how the Sony stacks up to the Iota VX SA3 integrated amplifier. So I'll be blunt here. There's only one advantage that the Sony has at this point, which is it's still the more powerful unit. Even though it can't really drive a 4 ohm load at all, for 6 ohm or higher speakers, yes, it'll take them to louder volumes. Otherwise, the Iota VX SA3 is better in literally every regard. Just think about whatever is important to you in regards to performance, and the Iota VX is just going to be better, more balanced, more refined, more resolute, more revealing, better bass performance, better mid-range performance, better imaging, just better, better, better. And if you need more power, you have the option of buying that additional amplifier. But it's also a lot more money. It's around $550 versus the anywhere between $99 to $150 that you pay for the Sony. So you just have to determine what's worth it to you. Anyways, guys, that is going to be my final take on this receiver. Thanks for watching, and peace.